This is going out to everywhere now, yeah? Is this going on to an end? Is it going on an end? Too late. Cheers, bud.
It's quite funny how
Maybe I should move to here so people see me, because I need people are walking past. Back then. Let's go past. Back then, look. I've just put out a live shot.
Costa from the European Union. It's a chance, as the Prime Minister would see it, to reset the UK's relationship with the EU. We'll have the latest.
Is this the Brexit betrayal?
And the EU have agreed to a landmark post-Brexit reset. Talks to finalise the agreement are said to have gone right down to the wire, right into the early hours of this morning. Now, the full detail of the deal will be revealed in the next few hours. Well, earlier, as news of parts of the agreement emerged, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, hosted a group of business leaders in Downing Street. An announcement is expected on food, defence and security, with reports that Britain could be able to use e-gates at European airports in the near future. Although details are due out later, it's understood the agreement also includes EU access to British fishing waters for the next 12 years. Well, the leader of Reform UK, Nigel Farage, claims that will be the end of the fishing industry. Well, at that reception in number 11 Downing Street, Rachel Reeves said doing business with Britain's European neighbours had been too difficult for too long.
our biggest trading partners, our friends, our allies in the European Union, and for too long it's been too difficult to export, to bring in talent, to trade with our nearest neighbours, and that's not good enough because it's held back our growth, it's held back our exports, and it's held back opportunities for Britain. And at a time when we're also facing war on the continent with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's also imperative that we work together with our friends and allies to keep Europe safe. And the deal today is about doing all of those things.
Well, earlier, the Prime Minister put this onto his social media. It is time, he said, to look forward, to move on from the stale old political fights and to find common sense, practical solutions that improve the lives of British people. He said, secure borders, cheaper bills, more jobs. We will close a deal in the national interest. Well, as I say, political leaders have been arriving for the last few minutes. Just sneaking in there before we got to him was David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary. As I say, we're going to keep a close eye across those political leaders from the UK and Europe who are arriving at Lancaster House. Outside, spotting them for us and with all the analysis is our political editor, Beth Rigby. Please say we can bring Beth in now. Morning to you, Beth. So, look, we've seen the Prime Minister and David Lammy go in, the Foreign Secretary. We've got some more detail as well in the past few hours about what this deal will entail.
Yeah, look, let's just start off with what a significant moment this is, though. The Prime Minister, in the Labour manifesto, promised a reset with the European Union. He promised to improve trading ties, and he promised to sign a defence and security pact. And that is the negotiation, essentially, that has been going down to the wire. And I was chasing it hard last night. As of 10:30 p.m, negotiations still were continuing, with a breakthrough happening, I'm told, at 2 a.m. in the morning. EU ambassadors signing off this deal at 7 a.m. And you've just seen the Prime Minister and his Foreign Secretary going in soon. The leaders of the European Union will be here to rubber stamp that deal and give us a press conference about it later. At the heart of it, what is this deal about? I think the arrowhead, if you like, will be this defence and security partnership. The UK and the EU have been talking about it. There is more urgency now that Trump is in the White House and signalling that the EU needs to step up its defence capabilities. You'll know that the European Union has set up a €150 billion rearmament programme for the European Union in order, in the words of European leaders, to expel any foreign threat or any threat to the European Union by 2030. And signing a deal will mean that the UK, crucially, can bid for some of that funding and loans in order to help arm up Europe. So that would be good news for the UK government. We don't have detail about how much of that fund the UK can access. That was subject of negotiations, but that a big win. And then where it got really messy between the European Union and the UK was around the trade deal and fishing rights. Now, the Prime Minister wanted a deal on veterinary goods. What that basically means is animal products. So it can be anything from food or other products where animal ingredients go into them. It could be paint, leather, it could be clothing. And the reason he wanted that was if he could get a deal of no checks on those sorts of goods going in and out of the UK to the continent, it could free up checks on up to 80% of goods passing. The Prime Minister selling that as a good deal for British shoppers in the supermarkets, prices coming down, trade becoming easier. So that was his prize. He put it in the manifesto, and that became a real sticking point because the European Union in return wanted a deal on fishing rights. Now, you might remember during the tense Brexit negotiations with Boris Johnson and the previous European negotiators, fishing was a massive sticking point. It's politically very sensitive, particularly in Scotland. Northern European countries want access to UK fishing waters. In the end, the UK and the UK and EU hammered out around 2020 a 4-year deal, or 2021. That needed to be renegotiated. The UK didn't want to budge, but the EU got a really significant win overnight, which was a 12-year deal, as I understand it, for access to UK fishing waters. In return, the Prime Minister got his deal on those the veterinary agreement on animal products. So both sides will come out of that claiming a win, but watch for the backlash today from Brexiteers, from the Conservative Party, from Reform, no doubt, about the Prime Minister giving away fishing rights. The other area which was under massive discussion was a youth mobility scheme. This is something that the Europeans really wanted, particularly the Germans. And I remember going over to Berlin when Chancellor Scholz was the leader of Germany, and he quite publicly said he wanted this in front of a Prime Minister that was saying, we're not dealing on that. Why? Because the government doesn't want to be seen to be backsliding in any way on freedom of movement. And also, of course, immigration is a particularly sensitive issue at the moment for the government. So where did they land? They've agreed to keep talking about a youth mobility scheme. This is where young people can come and travel, study, work in the UK for a certain period of time. This might be a European leader coming up. So they've agreed to keep talking, but the government haven't agreed concessions on that, and the UK government will take that as a win. And let's see who we've got coming here. It could be Kalakayas, who is effectively the foreign minister there. She is the European figure that has been leading negotiations on the defence agreement, which of course will be probably the big headline of this meeting, and some of the European diplomats going in there. That's the team that have been negotiating this deal. We're still waiting for Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President. So both sides will come out of this today saying it's a win-win. It was hard fought. It went down to the wire. It went right to the end. But they came out this morning with an agreement where both sides feel concessions have been made, but also that they have wins.
Absolutely, Beth. We'll keep an eye on all those people who are arriving, as I'm sure you will do as well. We've already had some of the reaction, haven't we, from Kemi Badenoch and from Nigel Farage, the Brexiters, about that fishing agreement. Nigel Farage saying it's the end of the fishing industry in Britain, if true. So that argument already being put in place. Beth, what do you make of the reporting that the talks on that youth mobility scheme are going to continue to go forward? As you rightly mentioned, it's been talked about for a number of years now that would be something that would happen in any reset that the UK has with the EU. Why do you think they're unable to announce it at this summit, or perhaps will they pull a rabbit out of the hat?
Well, look, I think on the youth mobility scheme, as I said, it's something that the European Union really wanted, and particularly some of the member states of the European Union, not least Germany. And it's something that the UK government have been reluctant to do because Keir Starmer, you will remember, was Mr. Second referendum. He was very pro the EU. He wanted a second referendum. He led that campaign. And when it came to the 2024 general election, he did not want to be seen as a Labour leader that might backslide in any way on Brexit. And freedom of movement was clearly a red line. They put it in the manifesto. Now, the youth mobility scheme would not be a return to freedom of movement, but the government is sensitive about it. They're sensitive about allowing younger people to come over to study and work. They're worried that that would open them up to political attacks about backsliding over Brexit. And obviously, as I was saying, immigration is such a sensitive issue, with 2.4 million visas being issued in the 3 years to June 2024. So the government trying to clamp down on immigration, people coming into the country. So announcing in the week that you did that last week, the following Monday, a youth mobility scheme. Politically, I think Number 10 felt that that was off. But where have they moved? Well, interestingly, late last night, some of my sources were saying the UK has thrown the Erasmus scheme back into negotiations. Now, you might remember the Erasmus scheme was a student exchange programme under the European Union, that when we were in the European Union, students would be able to come and study at each other's universities. That was thrown back in the mix by the government last night, and that was seen by some European leaders as a way of, if you like, sugarcoating the pill of not giving hard, concrete commitment on youth mobility. But what the two sides, as I understand it, have agreed is that they will continue talking about this. That will be good news for Keir Starmer, because he did not want what he sees as essentially improving trading terms and defence agreement. He didn't want that overshadowed by a row about backsliding over freedom of movement. So the UK government will take that as a win. But as you said, fishing is likely to be the real flashpoint today, particularly from the opposition parties, I think.
Yeah, he's got that row over fishing to deal with, hasn't he? Can probably put the row over youth mobility off until a little while longer. All right, Beth, back with you outside Lancaster House throughout the day. Thank you so much for now. Let's perspective, Adam, morning to you, on how all of this is being viewed from a European capital, this attempt by the UK to reset from those Brexit years.
Well, I think there's a few things to say. Is that firstly is that across the European Union, this won't have quite the resonance that it does in the UK. Brexit feels like quite a long time ago for plenty of people. But in Brussels, yes, they will want to reset this relationship, because they, over the past few years, and certainly since Brexit, have seen the value in closer ties between the UK and the EU. I think Ukraine knocked a lot of heads together, so that defence agreement might serve both parties. The fact that Boris Johnson, bluntly, is no longer Prime Minister, and there were people, including Mr Johnson, Liz Truss, David Frost, who were seen as antagonistic in the corridors of power in Brussels. So I think time has eased and softened some of those relationships as well. And I think that with Donald Trump in the White House, there's a feeling that Europe probably needs to coalesce a bit more, and that Europe, maybe in their mind, doesn't necessarily have to mean the European Union. So symbolically, they will see this as a significant big step forward in a new kind of working relationship. But listening to all the list of things that are seen as wins for the British government, keep in mind that the European Union is fundamentally an economic organisation. It's a trading body, and it's quite transactional. So everything that is seen as a win for the UK, Brussels will be saying, well, we need wins as well, and we're not going to sign up to something if we think we're on the wrong end of the deal. So fishing is a great example of that. The EU was worried that the present agreement would expire, that it would run into 1 year renegotiations, which wouldn't really work for them, but would probably empower the UK. So a 12-year deal for them feels big. Again, symbolically, remember, the UK fishing industry is frankly economically tiny. It's the turnover of the UK's entire fishing industry is half the turnover of Greggs. It's about the same as the turnover of Harrods. So while politically it has resonance, economically, the EU will say, come on, we need to be in these waters. On defence, they will want cooperation, but they will want it on their terms. They see defence as an important part of their economic might, and certainly in France, it's seen in that way. Youth mobility will be a sticking point for them, because they won't want to keep giving concessions and not getting anything in return. And that is something that young people across Europe have been crying out for. They often look at Britain and say, you decided to leave the EU. We may well welcome you back if you ask, but you left the EU, you chose to Brexit, and there has to be a cost for that. Not just because you've broken a deal, but also because there has to be benefits felt by the nations like Romania for staying in the EU. And that's probably brought out by the fact that since Brexit, there is no country across this union that has really a very loud, viable exit movement. Before Brexit, the Poles, the French, the Dutch all had these sort of nascent, well, if Britain leaves, we might follow. That sentiment, I think, has gone away. So they will look at this deal, they will welcome it, and if they can come up with something which classically neither side is that happy with, but both sides are happy to go along with, then it will feel like a first step. Ultimately, Ursula von der Leyen, Antonio Costa, Kaja Kallas, all of these people negotiating in London would probably most like a path that sees the UK return to the fold. There is a sense that the UK is missed, not necessarily by France and Germany, but by smaller countries, by Baltic nations who always felt that the UK was the mediator between the French and the Germans, and they are still missed, and the UK's economic power is still lacking in the EU. If that isn't going to happen, yes, they want a closer relationship. Yes, they want a newer, updated trading relationship, but they will still look at this as a deal and one where both sides have to make concessions.
Absolutely right. Okay, Adam, for now, in Bucharest, the capital of Romania, for a perspective on all of this from Europe. Thank you for now. More from you later, Adam. Well, let's speak now to... I want to thank you for making the time. From what you've heard from the reporting so far, what do you make of this, and is it a reset?
It's a very important step forward. It's a resumption of the dialogue between the EU and the UK that's been broken off since Brexit. But it's not a full-scale reset by any means. There are some important agreements. It opens the door to future negotiations. But in past years, we would have regarded this as a somewhat technical kind of an agreement, not a dramatic breakthrough.
I mean, so Michael, you will have heard the reporting this morning about the anger in the fishing industry about this agreement, that it's the agreement as is has been extended now for 12 years. What's your perspective on that, and whether or not that is a suitable compromise to have been made to achieve the rest of the agreement with the EU?
Anything to do with fisheries is very emotive. Also, there's some absurdity in today's world with threats from Putin and Trump of different natures to see a defence pact in some way subject to an agreement on fisheries. That said, the EU is looking for a win. I do understand that. But we have to put this into perspective. This is just a continuation of historic fishing patterns. And although it's been prolonged for 12 years, each year, quotas, a total allowable catch is set for conservation reasons on the basis of advice from marine biologists. This is divided up into national quotas. This system, which is really based on conservation as well as commercial exploitation, will continue. So this too is not quite as dramatic as the fishing industry in the UK might imply.
We're going to get a perspective from the fishing industry later. And so, Michael, look, just to warn you and warn our viewers, we are expecting Antonio Costa, the President of the European Council, as well as Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, to arrive in the next few minutes. We'll take those pictures live, Sir Michael. I'll interrupt you at that point. But for now, let's continue our conversation, if we can. So, look, so from your perspective then, Sir Michael, the key elements of this are what? The fact that there seems to be cooperation on the military and technological matters between the UK and EU in, as you put it, a world that seems more unstable and more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, this is the centrepiece. This agreement is not defence as such in the military sense, it's the defence industry. And for the UK to have access to the EU's new joint purchasing scheme for armaments is very important. It's called SAFE, S-A-F-E, this new arrangement. At the same time, there'll be an entry ticket to be paid by the UK for this, and we don't know yet what the sum will be for that. Equally important is easing conditions for trade. The present regime has imposed heavy costs, particularly on small and medium-sized companies in the UK who faced a lot of bureaucracy This will be simplified by easing veterinary and plant health rules. So it should be easier for British companies to sell into the EU in the future.
So, Michael, let's just get a bit more detail on that joint purchasing scheme. Is this part of the Commission's plan to offer up 800 billion euros in loans to make purchases for defence procurement and, of course, to rearm Western Europe in the face of what we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, it is, but we have to be a bit clearer on the numbers. There's actually 150 billion up front. And the hope is that the EU coming in with 150 billion will leverage up to 800 billion from other sources. So the UK will be getting access to this fund known as SAFE, but at the same time, the UK will have to pay into it. There will be net benefits to the UK, but we don't quite know the arithmetic on that yet. But symbolically, it's extremely important at this time with the war still raging in Ukraine, that the UK and the EU, including obviously Europe's two nuclear powers, France and the UK, should be cooperating on matters which will be vital to the future defence capability of both sides.
So, Michael, thank you for wrapping up that point for now, because as viewers can now see, we are looking at those Range Rovers that have arrived outside Lancaster House, containing both Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the EU Commission, alongside her in the grey suit there, Antonio Costa, President of the European Council. These two chiefs of the EU here, greeted by Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. Let's just take a moment to take in these pictures.
Why are you doing a deal that sells fishermen down the river? Why is this happening?
OK, well, as the three leaders there go into Lancaster House, let's bring back in our political editor, Beth Rigby. So the three main players in all of this, Beth, have now arrived for this key summit, historic summit, and discussions will continue.
Yeah, look, this is a big moment for all of those figures there, the two leaders of the European Union. There you had Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa, and then, of course, the British Prime Minister in between them. And this will be hailed as a big post-Brexit reconciliation, if you like, the first big summit between the EU and the UK since Brexit, and both sides will be billing this as the reset. As we were talking about earlier, at the heart of it will be a defence and security pact for the UK. That should mean that the UK and UK defence companies can access €150 billion rearmament fund being organised by the European Union. And then for the European Union and the UK, changes on trading arrangements. For the UK, the big win will be a deal on veterinary products being sent to and from the continent, checks lifted on those. The Prime Minister will no doubt say later that that will reduce the burden on red tape on huge amounts of products going to and forth, and drive prices down in supermarkets and in other ways. There will also be something we expect on energy and energy transmission, which the Prime Minister could say might help on energy bills. And then when it comes to the big sticking point, fishing rights, this was where the European Union drove a hard bargain. They wanted access to UK fishing waters. The Prime Minister moving on this and conceding on the longevity of a deal. There was a 4-year plan put in place under Boris Johnson, hard fought. The Prime Minister, as we understand it, agreeing a 12-year deal for access to UK waters. I'm also told by a source in government that the government will offer a fishing and coastal growth fund of about 360 million of investment in an attempt, I think, to ameliorate what they know will be the inevitable backlash from this. It's particularly sensitive in Scotland with those huge fishing waters, and there are elections in Scotland next year, and Labour will be sensitive to all of that. But I think both sides in the big picture will come out saying this is a win-win. The European Union can say it's got a deal on fishing, and it's got the UK government to commit to talks on youth mobility, on having more of a cultural, student and work exchange between young people across Britain and the continent. And for the UK, they'll be able to say we have fulfilled 2 manifesto pledges. 1, a security deal with the European Union, and 2, we have improved trading relationships with our biggest trading partners. So both sides will hail it as a win-win, and I have no doubt as the day goes on, some of the critics will be out to say that the Prime Minister has sold out fishermen on that fishing deal, not at least.
Yeah, absolutely right, Beth. We're going to hear from one such person in the next few minutes. Beth Rigby, there, our political editor outside Lancaster House. Thank you for now. Beth, back with you later. We're expecting a news conference from those leaders at around 12:30. Of course, we'll bring that to you live. But let's speak now to Michael Cohen, the Chief Executive of the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. Mike Cohen, thanks so much for being with us. What do you make of what you've heard from the reporting on this deal about fisheries so far?
It was very disappointing. The EU came to us to ask for a better deal on fish, to change its one-year access arrangements to something bigger, and we appear to have given a very much larger deal. 12 years of access rather than 12 months at a time is really disappointing for us. This was the last benefit left to the UK fishing industry from the deal that was done in 2020. It gave us a card in our hand in those annual talks that were mentioned by a previous speaker with Europe to try to reach a fairer division of quotas, to try to reach a more nuanced deal on where exactly European boats can access and bring other benefits to the UK. So we had a card in those negotiations, and we've now given it to the other side. And that's very worrying. And that doesn't just affect fishing as well. Giving a 12-year right of access to UK waters to fish allows the EU to bring pressure to bear on all sorts of aspects of marine management. We saw in the recent dispute that they brought over their ability to fish for sand eels in UK waters, that the EU is very willing to start trade dispute proceedings when it feels that its access to fish are limited. That has implications for offshore energy development plans, for offshore conservation plans, as well as for our ability to manage fisheries in our own waters.
So there are broader elements to this, Mike, as you point out. Why don't you just explain to our viewers the amounts of fish, the amount of access that EU boats are allowed into British waters, and vice versa? How much access are we allowed into EU waters?
Yeah, so the access is reciprocal, and EU vessels can fish right up to within 6 miles of our coast, up to the line that we call the inshore line. We could do the same in EU waters, but British fishing waters are far more valuable and far more useful. So we fish in EU waters maybe an eighth as much as they do in the UK. This is worth hundreds of millions of euros a year to European fishing fleets. And really, having been given that when we joined the EEC, even 50 years of time, EU fishing fleets have developed so that they're almost entirely dependent on taking resources from British territory. They're living beyond their own means and need to take fish from UK waters. We don't have that same reliance on EU waters. They're simply not as valuable, as you can see from how hard the EU fought to keep that level of control over the UK's seas.
Mike, in terms of fish stock, what impacts does that have? I don't think you're suggesting, or anyone's suggesting for a moment, that this kind of quota system is depleting our fish stocks in any really measurable way.
No, and this doesn't impact on the annual quota negotiations. They carry on as before. What we've done is kind of failed to keep hold of our best bargaining chip in those negotiations, but also we've weakened our ability to deviate in the rules that we placed for managing fish stocks in our waters by giving this long-term agreement, by allowing kind of trade disputes to continue to be raised if EU boats feel that they are excluded from that fishing access. We weaken our ability to diverge from the EU's plans on all sorts of marine management issues. The UK closed fisheries for sand eels, not fished by the UK, but fished a lot by Denmark in the last year. And that led to a trade arbitration proceedings being brought by the EU with a deal, or not a deal, sorry, a judgment in that case that both the UK and the EU announced as a win for themselves. So a complicated judgment. It demonstrated how quickly the EU will reach for trade dispute proceedings if it doesn't feel that its access is being maintained. We do lots of things in the sea apart from just fishing, and lots of things affect access for fishing boats. I can easily see a situation in which we want to develop the offshore wind industry more, as government has said it wants to, where we want to increase the size and the scope, management scope of marine protected areas. And that limits the access of European fishing boats, and they then start the sort of dispute that they did in the sand eel case. I think that 12 years is very challenging.
I mean, the government, as you know, Mike, has suggested that... sorry, that's not Mike, that's Brenda. We're going to speak to him next, but Mike's back. Sorry about that, Mike. Sorry about that, viewers. Mike, look, you will have seen some of the reaction to this in the early reporting of it from people opposed to it. Nigel Farage writing on social media that this will be the end of the fishing industry. Is that right?
No, it's not right, and that's not a helpful way to look at this. Look, improving the situation, and it's got to be remembered, we were not asking Europe for anything here. Europe asked something of us, and a lot of commentators are talking as though we are somehow getting our just desserts for asking for too much. We didn't ask for a thing. Something has been given away. Improving the deal that we have with Europe or changing things with Europe is not the only way to benefit the British fishing industry. We are an industry with a substantial scope for growth. The failure to do a better deal here has taken away the best route we could have achieved that, but it's not the only one. Fishing still remains important in a lot of coastal communities. We hear these ridiculous exaggerations, like I heard earlier, about fishing being less important than Harrods. The first sale value of fish is one thing, but that's like saying that the value of the arms industry, which is so precious today in these discussions, is just
Mike, sorry,
the sale value of steel. We're more important than that, and there's still
absolutely,
scope for that to benefit.
You made that point. Look, in defence of our correspondent making that point, he was saying that, you know, the fishing industry is worth sort of £1 billion per year. So in terms of the overall, it might be a small, very, very small part of a much bigger deal. Yeah.
It's a small number when you take it like that. If you look at the extra the extra value added, that's the first cost of raw materials. Then look at processing. Look at all the other jobs associated with fishing. Some recent work by economists in Cornwall reckon that you actually need to multiply that by a factor of something like 10 or 12 to get the true value of seafood in the UK. And in those coastal communities where fishing may be the best private sector source of income, it's hugely important. And that's what I don't want us to lose sight of. But look, this deal is not the only way that those communities can continue to do well or can benefit in the future.
So, Mike, look, I'm sorry to talk across you, but we haven't got loads of time, and I do want to get one last point to you on that. Coastal communities, there is this £360 million coastal growth fund that is due to be announced as part of all of this. What do you make of that, and how much, as Beth said, will that ameliorate some of the damage potentially caused by the 12-year span of this deal?
As always, the devil's in the details with these things. Boris Johnson announced £100 million for the fishing industry after his terrible deal in 2020, and we saw almost none of that. The majority of that went to ports and harbours, very few of them in any way assisting fishermen, and very little of that money came anywhere near a fishing business, even indirectly. So we need to see what the details are. £360 million over 12 years. It will achieve something if it's well targeted, and that's what we need to see. I certainly hope government will work closely with us over how that money is spent, and if it's spent well, then it can bring benefits for sure. But it needs to be cleverly spent and well targeted at the coast where it will actually help.
Absolutely. All right, Mike Cohen, really good to speak with you. Sorry to talk across you, but busy morning, but good conversation. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, let's bring in now, you saw his face a moment ago, but Brendan Chilton joins us now for a bit longer. Brendan, good to have you with us, former General Secretary of Labour Leave and CEO of the Independent Business Network. Let me get your reaction first, your thoughts as to what you've heard so far reported about this reset with the EU.
Well, good morning. I think obviously this particular objective to secure a new deal with the European Union was obviously in the Labour manifesto, and so the government has it's perfectly right for the government to try and achieve that. But what the government needs to do is to very, very carefully look at the politics of all this. I know, for example, the youth mobility scheme, it's sort of yet to be determined. What we've heard, nothing's been ironed out yet. But in the last 3 weeks, the government has been absolutely resolute in talking about the need for stronger border controls, fewer migration, etc. So if you're going to have a youth mobility scheme, and of course we do have one with countries like Australia, we need to be very careful on the politics of all this, because we're saying on the one hand that we wish to have stronger borders, while today potentially signing up to a deal that makes those borders less secure by having more mobility for younger people. And that's the issue the government will have. Tomorrow's headlines will be government sells out on migration. And we're going to need some pretty strong comms around that to ensure that what the government is trying to achieve, which is a similar arrangement, as I said, with countries like Australia, but for youth mobility in Europe, is not taken over by a borders are open campaign from those that are hostile to the government's position.
Yeah, but isn't the truth of that, Brendan, that since Brexit, since we left the European Union, since the argument was made that we need to take back control of our borders, net migration has soared. It's gone up by millions. So the argument that this now will be the thing that affects our migration levels, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
You're right to say that since we've left the European Union, migration has gone up. But the point I'm making is that the government over the past few weeks have said their primary aim is to reduce migration, to have stronger borders, etc., which, is absolutely the right thing to do. It's what the British people want. They will need to square that off with their new proposals for youth mobility, which does seem to stand in contrast to the first stated objective. Now, personally, I think youth mobility is a good thing, so long as it's controlled, limited, and doesn't lead to people then settling permanently in the way that happened before when we was in the European Union. But what we need to do is to, as I say, make sure there are very strong communications around this, because, as I said, on the one hand, the government are saying they want to have stronger controls and less migration, but today are signing a deal with the European Union that expands potentially migration for younger people. Of course, it will be reciprocal. Brits will be able to go to the EU, and EU nationals will be able to come to the UK. But that whole movement argument for young people is taking place on one issue in British politics, and the government are trying to address that. They bring numbers down and at the same time support a mobility scheme. So squaring those two off is going to be the challenge.
It will, and it'll take a moment for them to kind of work it through, I presume, Brendan, which is perhaps why we are told at this point that they are going to continue talking about that youth mobility scheme if it were to come in. I think it's reported earlier as well by Johnny Reynolds that for the schemes that we already have in place like that, it's about 25,000 people that get visas to come in. He was very clear that it's going to be sort of strictly time limited. There's no dependents can be brought in, making the point again that it's not a return to freedom of movement. But do you accept that there needs to be something there that allows young people across Europe, as you say, both ways, to be able to spend time and provide for and benefit the economies of our nearest neighbours?
Oh, I mean, I have no objection to a controlled movement for young people. We have, as I said, a similar arrangement with Australia and a number of other countries where young people from the UK can go and live, work and study there for a designated period of time and then return. And I see no reason why that would be a problem with the European Union. But as I said, the key issue is making sure that those movements take place for the designated period of time and don't exceed that. We don't want to see a situation where, for example, vast numbers of young people can come to the UK for their study period, and then once their study period is over, or their work period or whatever it is, then stay here permanently without going through a proper application system. We don't want to return to freedom of movement, and Labour have said that that's not going to happen. So as this deal is thrashed out, and of course we're yet to see the detail of all this, we need to ensure that as a starting principle is at the centre of any movement deal for young people. But as I say, very good for both economies, very good for skills, very good for the development of young people. It's very good to see that post-Brexit, the government is adopting deals like this, as they have done with other countries around the world.
Indeed. All right, Brendan Chilton there, former General Secretary of Labour Leave. Thank you so much for your time and analysis this morning, Brendan. Good to speak with you. All right, let's bring in Ed Conway, our economics and data editor. He's in central London for us. Ed, good to see you with us again, and nice to see you put a tie on for this. So, Ed, what do you make of the deal that we've seen so far?
Well, I mean, so what we've got so far of this is, I mean, we have the initial kind of bare bones of this, and we're going to get more in the coming hours. So far, it doesn't, to be honest with you. I mean, there are going to be lots of numbers that are going to come out, and we're going to hear from government, no doubt, about how this is really improving the scale of economic growth in this country. I would be very, very surprised if, when we actually dug into those numbers, that they didn't look quite small, because this is relatively small stuff in comparison with the size of the economy. This is not to say it doesn't make a difference. You know, being able potentially to travel more easily, not to have to wait in as long a queue at passport control, being able to do, in particular, those deals where if you're young and you want to travel and study in the EU, you can. That in the long run can help economic growth. But generally speaking, when you're looking at that and plugging that into how much GDP, gross domestic product, it actually means for the UK economy, it is relatively small. And so I think, you know, it's worth just kind of being realistic about this. This definitely, there will be lots of sound and fury about this. The actual economic impact is going to be relatively small. But that being said, you know, the impact of Brexit wasn't necessarily quite as big as in some of those scary numbers, the lurid statistics we got around the time of the referendum. And that's because the nature of the relationship with the EU is relatively, it's technical. It's about regulations. It's about whether you can easily kind of shift goods from one part of the continent to another. And gradually being able to improve that is certainly going to make a difference to the UK economy, but it may not be enormous. And so I think that, you know, in practice, I think there's going to be a lot of politics we're going to hear about today. Put it alongside the deal that we've had announced with India, the deal that, or rather the agreement agreed with the US as well. And certainly the impression is of the UK doing deals in many other countries around the world. But the impression also, when you dig into the details, is so far none of that is actually having an impact. With the US deal, we don't even know when it's actually kicking in. We don't know what the quotas are for certain goods. With the India deal, it's going to take a long time before that actually starts to bed into the economy. And for this as well, I think the numbers will be relatively small. But as I say, this is primarily really about the politics rather than about the economic impact. And I think anything that can start gradually to improve the UK's living standards, I think will be welcomed by many people. The question is, what are the compromises along the way, and what does it mean for parts of the economy, like fisheries, like agriculture, that are often affected by these deals?
Absolutely. All right, Ed, for now, thank you for that analysis. Ed Conway there in central London. Let's speak to Alfred Quantrill, who's president of Young European Movement UK. Alfred, thanks so much for making the time to speak with us this morning. So, I mean, I guess you're very keen on there being this agreement for a youth mobility scheme, as we're told. That has been put off a little bit to talk about it a bit more in a bit more detail. What's your sense as to whether or not we will end up getting an announcement on that youth mobility?
So I am really hoping that we do. I think it's somewhat unclear at the moment exactly the structure the youth mobility scheme is going to take. I think a lot of people in the EU, and certainly us at the Young European Movement, we're really hoping to see something around Erasmus+. I think at the moment a lot of structure for young people to take opportunities that were once available has been lost. And so I think it's really important that the government not only has this youth mobility scheme, which allow people to go and work, go and travel, but also tap back into that Erasmus Plus network as part of a youth mobility scheme to ensure that the education and training opportunities, and this is not just for middle-class students, but so much of Erasmus Plus and the capacity that we could get from a youth mobility scheme is about internships, apprenticeships, horticulturalists going to the Netherlands, lawyers doing their training, engineers, electricians going abroad to Europe, these things that we once had. Young people in the UK are really stifled at the moment, I think all of us feel, in terms of our opportunities. And so being able to broaden out and go to Europe and get the kind of training, education, cultural experience we once had, I think is really important. It will have an impact on the economy, like we were just hearing. It's not going to be huge, but I think in terms of the individual impact this can make on young people's lives, the individual stories we can get from people being able to travel and upskill is really huge, really important. And so we're really hoping to see an improvement here.
And Alfred, I appreciate you framing it in that way, because I think it's probably important. Our viewers may have heard a couple of times this Erasmus scheme, Erasmus Plus, this morning, but perhaps have no idea what that actually means. Can you just take us through what the Erasmus scheme was and what we'd look for it to be if it were to come back properly? Sure. So the Erasmus scheme originally was just a kind of student exchange programme, but the EU has massively broadened this out now. So about 85% of billions of euros goes on upskilling and training young people up to the age of 30 to move across the EU. So this is a kind of unilateral program that we can tap into and get access to a lot of funding to not only allow for university students to go and study elsewhere, but for, as I was saying earlier, internships, structured training, vocational training is a really huge, important part of this. And I think youth mobility schemes are great, but the fact that the Erasmus scheme, something we can receive a lot of benefit for, gives that kind of structure to young people. It really helps a lot. Maybe young people who feel lost, don't know where they're going to go next with their lives. The Erasmus scheme can give a really clear, direct opportunity for these people to go out, get training, get skills, and get into the workforce in a really productive and advantaged way. And Alfred, I don't know if you heard my conversation a little while ago with Brendan Chilton, who was a former General Secretary of Labour Leave. He said that any sort of discussion around a youth mobility scheme runs up against the government's stated aim to bring down migration. I mean, how do you answer that sort of charge from those who are concerned about a youth mobility scheme? So I would say, for a start, there's been discussions around one in, one out. So if that was implemented, there would be very clear net zero migration on that. I think it's also important to emphasise that a lot of people in the UK want to go out to Europe. So even if we get people coming in here, there will be huge numbers of people, young people in the UK who want to go to the EU. They want to get these experiences, for example, you know, in travel industries, all these industries that people want to go out to, like they used to, and now they don't have the chance to. So I think, yeah, it's true. We will get European people coming here, presumably high-skilled people who are ambitious. They want to train, they want to learn, they want to work here for a brief time. And it's really important to emphasise as well that this would be a time-limited scheme. So there's no people coming here with family members, children, claiming benefits or whatever. None of that is going on here. This is a clearly time-limited scheme for working, for training. And I think that would just be an absolute net benefit to not only youth in the UK who really deserve these opportunities that their peers in Europe have, but European youth who want to come here and fill the gaps in our economy as well. All right, Alfred Quantrill from the President of the Young European Movement UK and a student from Bristol. Appreciate your time, Alfred, and all the best to you. Thank you. Thank you.